I think it's fair to say that when it comes to motorcycle suspension, lubricants and damping fluids, the likes of Hagen shocks and Silcolene have probably forgotten more than you or I will ever know. When it comes to fork oil, it is just that. Fork oil is just fork oil, right? When I started doing the research for making this video, I didn't have any preconceived ideas about what fork oil I was going to use. The idea was I would just go down to my local dealership and pick up whatever was on the shelf. But the more I read into it, the more bewildered I became. For example, oil weights. Apparently there is no international standard for a fork oil weight. So when you buy a 20 weight oil, you're relying on the manufacturer's interpretation of what a 20 weight oil is. It might actually be an SAE 17.5 or it could be an SAE 22. Which is why when you change one brand of 20 weight oil for another brand of 20 weight oil, you can often get a completely different damping reaction in your forks. And another thing that I didn't appreciate is that on average, your standard fork oils will lose 20% of the viscosity in the first 1,000 miles that they're used. And then you start trying to wrap your head around viscosity indexes. Different brands and grades of oil have a different viscosity index. The lower the index, the more the viscosity of that oil will actually change according to the temperatures that it's been subjected to. And those variations can be huge. The higher the viscosity index, the less it changes according to the temperatures that it's subjected to. So it's a more stable damping oil. Now, we do think of fork oil as just being a damping oil, but there's a lot more to it than that. Motorcycle forks have a lot of working, moving parts, so they need to be lubricated. So that oil, as well as a damping oil, is also a lubricant. Many of the parts in that fork are also made of ferrous materials, so it needs to inhibit rust. And also your fork seals are very delicate elements of your suspension system, so fork oil also plays a role in preserving them. So it makes sense that you need to research the fork oil that you're going to use to make sure that you've got the best possible product for the use that you're going to put it to. Also, the general recommendation that you should change your fork oil around every 10,000 miles is way off the mark. And most of the advice that I've been given is that it should be changed yearly at least. Now, during my research, one name kept coming up and I didn't actually know initially who made it, and that was RSF5 fork oil. And apparently even the competition mountain bike community swear by this oil for mountain bikes. Now, in motor racing, your average racing bike is subjected to stresses and pressures that your average road bike is never going to see in its entire life. And to that end, every element of that machine needs to work consistently from the beginning of the race right to the end of that race. And that includes the suspension. Now, Silcolene's RSF range has been developed for the motor racing industry, where the demand for a suspension fluid is that it must give exactly the same consistent results at the end of a race that it did at the beginning of the race. Otherwise, vital seconds are lost. Now, the RSF range has a very high viscosity index. In fact, when I looked into this, its viscosity index is 3 to 4 times higher than your average suspension fluid, which makes it just about the most consistent fork oil on the market. And to ensure that racing teams get exactly the right product, exactly the right grade of product that they need, Silcolene have dumped the W or weight rating altogether. And the number on the bottle denotes just its position in their range rather than a weight. For example, RSF5 is an SAE 20 fork oil or suspension fluid. The RSF 2.5 is an SAE 10. And this ensures that a racing team gets exactly what it's looking for when it buys that product, not just someone else's interpretation of what it should be. So it stood out to me as being the fork oil that I should be using, and I'm not disappointed. It was obvious right from the first drop that came out of the bottle that this is something completely different from any other fork oil that I've used in the past. It doesn't produce and hang on to bubbles the way most fork oils do, which will improve its consistency. And if the maker's claims are right, it'll be giving me the same consistent results in a year's time when I change it as it did the day I poured it out of the bottle into the forks. Now that's that element of this Bonneville's suspension change out of the way. I've chosen what I consider to be the most consistent and stable fork oil on the market. So now I can judge those Hagen upgrades on their own merits without having to worry about unknown factors that might be affecting their performance. Now I've had these Hagen Nitro piggyback shocks on for several months now, and in that time, due to other work pressures and due to the weather, I've only actually managed to put about 400 miles on them. And it is generally accepted that these Hagen shocks don't settle down to peak performance until they've done between 500 and 1,000 miles. They need a certain bedding in period. I did notice an immediate improvement when I put them on. Formerly, this Bonneville's suspension felt, to all intents and purposes, dead. It was difficult to discern what the wheels were doing underneath you, and there was very little feedback from the road, either at the front or the back of the bike. The bike, by and large, did handle okay. It just felt vague, and it was only when you really started to try and put it through its paces on fast, bendy back roads with a less than perfect road surface that you would start to feel that you were pushing your luck. These Hagen Nitros did address that insofar as it could without me making modifications to the front suspension. It shares the same basic configuration as the standard Nitros, but that additional reservoir on the back did make for a much more, let's say, sophisticated behaviour. The name Nitro, of course, is derived from the fact that these are nitrogen-filled shocks, and this sets them apart from cheaper air-filled shocks. Nitrogen is much more stable under pressure and when subjected to heat than air is. So again, the key word here is stability. The standard Nitros are a fantastic shock, there's no doubt about it, and I have no complaints about the ones that I have fitted to the T120. But with the piggyback version, Hagen have turned up the volume a bit. And when I say volume, I mean oil. The additional reservoir allows the shock absorber to contain a greater volume of damping oil. This means that when you subject this shock absorber to a relentless battering on poor road surfaces at speed, the shock's ability to recover is greatly enhanced. The larger volume of oil means that the oil heats up more slowly, but also cools quicker. Again, the key element here being that it enhances stability and consistency in the damping department. These are not a shock that's designed for day-to-day commuting on congested, potholed roads. At low speeds, they do feel very firm, and you can actually be forgiven for thinking that they're too stiff. But as with the standard Nitros, the real magic kicks in when you get above 35 or 40 miles an hour, where that stiff feeling suddenly turns into a magic carpet ride. These are a shock designed for the open road. You can't feel it working, but the shock is working really hard to keep that back tyre in contact with the ground. They remove all that drama from a badly surfaced road. And it's only when you hit the very worst road imperfections that it actually lets you know that it is there. They're a true competition shock with an element of the long distance motorcycle tourer or commuter still present in its DNA. Yes, I've no doubt about it, if you go and spend £1,500 on a top of the range Öhlins, you probably are going to get a better shock, but I personally doubt it's going to be £1,000 better shock. And Hagen don't go in for brightly coloured tinsel and glitter. That's for the Boy Racer Brigade. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that these shocks do impress me, but it's only when you put the second half of the puzzle together that everything really comes into its own. Don't get me wrong, I was expecting an improvement from these progressive springs for the front forks. But what I wasn't prepared for was the alchemy that 70 years of motorcycle suspension development on the part of Hagen shocks when these springs are combined with those nitro shocks. The difference literally smacks you in the face, and what was a willing to please but slightly over the hill cart horse is suddenly transformed into what feels like a thoroughbred racehorse in its prime. The first thing that I noticed was a feel for the road that just wasn't there before. What was a vague, wishy-washy and unresponsive front end had suddenly become a precision steering tool. The bike immediately feels as though it's sitting just a little bit higher at the front, which I wasn't expecting because that's not what you expect from a softer spring. In short, the front end feels about as well sorted as you could possibly hope it could be. It inspires confidence, and it's not long before you find yourself squeezing more power out of the bike and dropping into bends and curves more aggressively than you would have dared to do before. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that that RSF5 suspension fluid does play a significant role in how this all comes together. But after I'd completed these modifications, I decided to go for a test ride of maybe 10 miles just to see how it all stacked up. 3 hours later, with a huge grin on my face, I'd covered over 100 miles. And if it wasn't for the fact that I had other things to do, I'm sure I would have just continued riding. There's still a long way to go with this bike, both cosmetically and performance wise. But as far as performance upgrades go, this suspension upgrade so far has provided me with far more smiles per gallon than anything else that I've done to the bike. If nothing else, if you can't afford the nitro shocks or the nitro piggyback shocks and you have one of these bikes, do yourself a huge favour. Invest the £80 or so in the spring upgrade kit. Seriously, it will change your whole perspective of the bike. Now, that's about all I've got time for this week. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be back next week as usual, although I haven't got a clue what I'm doing yet. So until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.